Again, man. How you doing?
Hello. I was about to take a sip, but then you threw it to me.
Gotcha.
Sooner than I thought. Can I just tell you guys before we get started? I gotta tell you all that. So I, as you guys know, I'm about to launch a book in a couple of months, and I've been like saying no to pretty much every podcast request except for my own Triple Click. But when you guys reached out, I was like, FPS, man, I love those guys, so I gotta say yes for this.
Oh,
so you guys are very special. You guys have an exception in my heart. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's gonna go to our heads.
You should let it. You should let it get to your hands.
The book, by the way, we'll knock off the book stuff at the top. Tell us just briefly about the book you're working on.
Sure. So we'll talk more about this closer to then, so people can look forward to that. But yeah, it's called Play Nice: The Rise, Fall, and Future of Blizzard Entertainment. It comes out October 8th. It's a hell of a story. It's actually a story very similar to the Bungie one in many ways. There are a lot of parallels there that I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, it's a hell of a story. It's the 33-year saga of Blizzard, starting from when it was 2 college students all the way up until today. Goes through pretty much every era, from like the creation of Warcraft and Diablo and Starcraft to Overwatch and Hearthstone. I mean, pretty much the development of every game they made is in here. And then all the way up to the battles between Activision and Blizzard, and then the Microsoft acquisition and the lawsuit, of course. And yeah, the whole story is in there. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to checking it out. And I mean, look, if anyone doesn't know Jason Schreier, I mean, everyone who's watching this podcast knows who Jason Schreier is, but in the off chance you don't, obviously, Jason is the biggest sort of scoop maker in the games industry business. Obviously, previously at Kotaku, now working at Bloomberg. How long have you been at Bloomberg now?
4 years.
Wow.
4 years. Okay. Wow, that's cool. And
yeah, everyone's like, "Oh my god, 4 years!" But pandemic time is just like a different world.
Fucks everything up. But yeah, consistently incredible reporting across the board for what's going on behind the scenes of the video games industry. We as commentators are always talking about what, firsthand reporting happens, like what you guys are able to uncover. And so, always really appreciate the work that you do and really interested to read it. Particularly, this recent stuff with Bungie. Obviously, the background to this, if anyone is unaware, is that Bungie has laid off hundreds of people. That was both now as well as last year. They did 200 layoffs this week. They did 100 last year in October. They also moved out 375 developers. I can't remember the exact
I'll tell you
number.
the numbers. So the numbers are 220 laid off last week, 155 moved to Sony, and then another 40-ish are going to spin out a new studio under Sony. They're working on an incubation project at Bungie, and that's now going to move to be under the Sony umbrella instead.
Exactly. Yeah. So obviously, you provided some in-depth reporting on that recently over at Bloomberg, and we kind of just wanted to talk through that for anyone that hasn't seen that reporting yet, but also talk about what it was like to have those conversations with those Bungie people adjacent, etc. So yeah, let's I guess kick it off. I think the overall story that emerged from this is one of Bungie's leadership overextending themselves and committing to the studio to far too many projects without necessarily enough risk built in, or to cushion the risk. What can you tell us about the sort of decisions Bungie made along the way?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we need to provide some context here because it's important to know that this stuff doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So going back to pandemic times, 2020, 2021, there's a ton of growth like all at once in the video game industry. Pretty much every game is doing well. All of these online games especially are doing exceptionally well. Animal Crossing explodes. Fortnite is everywhere. Among Us and Call of Duty Warzone and Destiny, of course, is doing well as well. They're no exception. And at the same time, interest rates are super low, and a lot of the big game companies flush with cash, able to borrow money at incredibly low rates, and also just thinking that this pandemic growth will never end, they decide, hey, we're gonna make some acquisitions. Microsoft buys Activision Blizzard for $69 billion. Take-Two buys Zynga for $12 billion, maybe the worst acquisition in video game history, because that has just been a disaster for them. And then, of course, Sony buys Bungie for $3.6 billion. which is kind of a crazy amount for a game studio that operates a single game. And at that point, Bungie is, if I'm remembering correctly, between 800 and 900 people, like around that size. And then, flush with Sony cash and looking to kind of find the next big thing after Destiny, Bungie goes out and they expand and they hire like crazy. They hire hundreds of new people in the next couple of years. And at the same time, they're doing all these incubation projects. A lot of these hires are for new stuff. They've been doing incubation projects even before that. And so they are kind of trying to juggle a bunch of different things at once. And that leads to some problems, especially when it turns out the pandemic growth is not actually sustainable. And when people can go back to leaving the house, they're not playing quite as many video games. And so then we hit this time of higher interest rates and flattened growth, and especially in the console space, a real lack of growth. And suddenly all of those hires are more of an albatross than like this cool new opportunity. And at the same time, Destiny 2 is not where it should be. Lightfall is a huge miss for them. They lose a lot of their player sentiment takes a hit. They lose a lot of money, or they're not making as much money as they thought they would. During one meeting last year, Pete Parsons, the CEO, told staff that they had missed their revenue targets by 45%, which is a crazy number. So now we're at this point where Bungie is losing money every day. They're getting a lot of pressure from their higher ups, and they've launched way too many incubation projects in an attempt to like find the next big thing. And so they go through these two different rounds of layoffs. And with this most recent one, they decide, okay, we're going to focus on Destiny and we're going to focus on Marathon. And hopefully Marathon is a big hit, and hopefully we can keep Destiny going, and we're going to slim down and we're going to get rid of a lot of those incubation projects and really just focus on what works. And of course, that means eliminating a lot of jobs, and that's where we're at now.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So I think one of the things that came through from I guess Stephen Tillo's reporting on this was the idea that Bungie sort of overpromised to Sony in that acquisition, that they sort of like overstated their earnings potential in the future. Did you, in your discussions with anyone, chance upon any of that sort of stuff?
That's not something that I can back up, but I certainly trust Steven. Steven's a great reporter, and his post on his story on GameFile is well worth checking out. That's not something that I've reported or would feel comfortable saying anything about right now.
Yeah, fair enough. I think obviously there's a lot of talk about Pete Parsons' role within all of this as sort of, CEO of the company. What, in your discussions, how were people talking about his role in these decisions, and how are they feeling towards him at this point, especially given all that stuff that came out about his car collection?
Yeah, I want to get to the car collection. I'll get to that in a second.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was generally a pretty well-liked guy from what I've gathered. I mean, he was someone who was certainly seemed to a lot of people at Bungie like he was standing up for what was right. He was on the front lines with people like marching, I believe, during the Black Lives Matter protests. He was like out there at protests and like was tweeting pictures of himself, and like I think he won some favor there. He's been outspoken about like progressive issues that I think a lot of Bungie people that resonate with a lot of Bungie people. He also led them to this position as the CEO. And while I think ultimately betting on a lot of incubation projects, it is kind of, I mean, there is logic behind it, right? Like you want to hedge your bets a little bit in case Destiny declines, in case Marathon doesn't pan out. You want to have a studio that is capable of doing new IP and creating new stuff, and like doing something that isn't just Destiny and Halo. But the way in which it all went down, and the kind of the speed of the layoffs, the fact that Pete Parsons hasn't really held himself accountable, certainly the fact that he still has a job even after making the decisions that led to all these other people losing their jobs, and then also the kind of the sense of optimism that he preached. I mean, there was a lot of messaging from him and from other leaders at the company that like, hey, we really have to work hard, we have to make Final Shape really awesome, where really the company is counting on this, it's got to be great, yada yada yada. And then for it to to the team to then execute on it and make something really great that a lot of people loved, only to then have 200 people lose their jobs anyway. That has left a really, really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. The car thing, man, that's like tackiness to an extreme on one hand. I think, like, personally, I feel like we should be looking at his decisions as a leader more so than how he spends his money. Like, dude can spend his money however he wants. I think the problem is when you spend your money on like a luxury hobby and then it becomes public. And from what I've heard, he's like talked about it internally too to people.
Yeah,
like,
that's,
hey.
Yeah, there was the tweet about you.
There was that tweet.
You were saying, "Come see my cars," and then you laid us all off 2 days later, which was. And then him,
That's wild, man.
locking
wild.
his Twitter account too. I think did him no favors. Like, really, if you were that afraid of pushback and seeing the pushback, I don't know, just delete the app from your phone and just
100%. Yeah, and I think it's like you have money, fine, spend it how you want, but like once it gets into public territory, I mean, I've heard stories like that before about like company. I mean, Blizzard is a great example. There's some stuff about this in my book about how like a company's founders sell their company and they get really rich, and then they come to work driving sports cars, and the people below them are like, well, what the hell, like we didn't get any of that money. Where's our Ferrari? Like, what the heck? And it really, that sort of thing just kind of hammers home the disparity, the income inequality there. I say if you have a bunch of money, just buy a bunch of Legos and keep them in your house and don't show them off to everybody. Buy a bunch of Funko Pops and start a collection.
This is the mature way to handle finance.
Exactly. Right. Or you know what? I mean, just get a collection of Rolexes and keep them in your bedroom and just look at them yourself. Don't show them to anyone else. Just like keep your wealthy habits to yourself and maybe like save them for the country club in the Hamptons. And that's enough.
Wanting to come back to something you said just then, are you saying that sort of Pete Parsons was putting out this message during the development of Final Shape that like, hey guys, we really need this to pop, we really need this to be great, but then in your reporting you said that the decisions to make these cuts were actually made in advance of the Final Shape's release. Is that correct?
Yeah, Totillo reported that, and that's something that I've heard as well. That's something that I can back up as well, that like this was in the works for at least a month before. I don't remember exactly when Final Shape came out, but I know that it was in the works for at least a month before the layoff actually hit. There have been rumors about it internally. People have been hearing rumors about layoffs, sharing rumors about layoffs. Nobody really knew the full scope of it or how big it was going to be, but people knew it was coming. It was in the air at Bungie.
So you're saying a month before the release of Final Shape, it was...
No, sorry, a month before the layoff. I don't remember exactly when Final Shape came out or if that was like the same about timing, but yes, it was definitely clear that like this streamlining was going to happen no matter what happened with Final Shape. I also think that it was very clear to Bungie that it wasn't like, I mean, so one thing I can share is that I heard that, I think I included this in my story, but basically leadership presented a bunch of staff with this presentation that just showed that like year over year expansion sales were going down, and that's part of their thinking behind no longer pursuing these big tentpole annual expansion releases. And so I think it was very clear to them that like Final Shape wasn't going to be the next Fortnite and like suddenly bring 10 million new players to Destiny 2. Like even at its best, it had a pretty low ceiling, so it wasn't going to be able to save all these jobs, and it wasn't going to be able to stop the streamlining and stop the pressure from Sony and so on and so forth. I think the messaging from Sony, I mean, the chairman of Sony took the rare move a few months ago, I believe it was in February, of criticizing Bungie and saying they needed to be more efficient, which is pretty wild. And I think really, I mean, reading the tea leaves, I think at that point you knew layoffs were on the way. Like as soon as he said that, you knew layoffs were on the way.
Yeah. Interesting that point about, you know, annual sales of expansions declining year on year. That is something that I had sort of sensed given the player count numbers that I saw for Final Shape. That was an expansion that was like 2 or 3 times better than Lightfall, but it had a higher like peak concurrent player count, right? So I'm interested to know, in your discussions with Bungie staff, was there any sense of how Bungie got to that point? Why why was Destiny not growing? Did staff have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there are always a lot of factors with this sort of thing. I think the biggest one is just that it's long in the tooth. I mean, every online game is going to have a peak and then fall. World of Warcraft hit a peak of 12 million subscribers and then just went down from there. And that has not hit even close to those heights again. I think that was in the Wrath of the Lich King / right before Cataclysm era. And a lot of these online games follow similar trajectories. It's not like super shocking, especially with a game like Destiny 2, where as much as people have enjoyed the expansions, it is still fundamentally the same game. You're not getting like, there aren't new races, there aren't new, like it doesn't feel drastically different. And also, this is probably the biggest factor, is that there's no onboard ramp for new players. Like it is a very difficult game, almost impenetrable for new players because of all the different types of gear and proper nouns, and like the story just not even being available in full right now. Like you can't play the entire story. You had to have been there for a lot of the releases. So it's really, there isn't an onboarding ramp, which I think really cuts off the potential base of players. So I mean, with Final Shape, for example, like it wasn't like a lot of people were coming out and saying this is really cool, but it's not like people were saying this is the time to go into Destiny 2 and start playing for the first time ever. Like that was not the conversation. The conversation was, if you've been playing for 10 years, this is awesome, but that is not how you bring in new players.
Yeah, that's sadly 100% correct.
I was going to say that's like exactly the conversation we've had in the lead up to.
That's a conversation I've had about every expansion to Destiny in a long time, you know. But the difference being that those previously Destiny's had a lot of challenges in its core game, in its progression, its systems, whatever else. And ironically enough, Bungie solved almost all of those with this expansion. Like this really is a fantastic rendition of Destiny. And it's very sad to see it sort of coupled now with this narrative where the future of the game is so uncertain. One thing I wanted to ask actually is, you know, for we as players, we're really fucking bummed out to hear no more no more annual expansions. Those were a big deal for us. Did you, in your discussions with any Bungie staff, did they have a view on what that means to them? Like that personal sort of reflection on how they feel about the future of the game, did any of that bubble up in your conversations?
No, I don't think there's a lot of like, I don't think a lot of people are bummed out about that they're not going to have to keep doing these paid expansions, these annual expansions. I think the annual expansions, I think the cadence is really tough. In fact, if you look at the history of the ones that were best received were also the ones that had to slip beyond the yearly cadence. Yes. Final Shape and before that Witch Queen were the two like most critically acclaimed ones of the past few years, and both of those slipped. Witch Queen was supposed to be out in 21 and it fell to February 22, and then Final Shape was supposed to be out in February of this year but slipped to June. Whereas Lightfall, the one that was on time, everybody hated. So yeah, I mean, I think that annual cadence has always been really tough for people. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of respect for Tyson Green, the new director of the game. He's another longtime Bungie guy, super veteran dude. And I think a lot of people that I've spoke to who are, I shouldn't say a lot, at least some of the people that I spoke to who are remaining on the Destiny team specifically are optimistic about his vision for the game. And that vision, at least in the short term, is going to be like, there's definitely going to be some sort of paid content. I'm not sure what that's going to look like or how it's going to unfold. It might be those smaller packs. I'm not 100% sure. There's also going to be stuff like Into the Light, those sorts of releases. There's going to be a lot of grind stuff. There's going to be refactoring of ritual activities. That's a big part of the plan as well. And there's definitely stuff.
When you say refactoring, what do you mean by refactoring?
I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure. I
just
know that
that's what someone said to you.
Yeah, well, the way it was described to me, I don't remember the exact wording. And again, this is, I got to talk about my own Destiny journey because I stopped playing at Forsaken, so I might get some of the terminology wrong.
It's a good jumping off point. You chose a good time to get off. Yeah.
I did. Well, it also, not coincidentally, my first kid was born in the fall of 2019, which was like a few months after, a year after Forsaken. So it worked out so that I pretty much stopped after having a child because you can't really play Destiny and have small children at the same time unless you only play like 8 p.m. and beyond, and then you can't play anything else. So it wasn't gonna work for me. The ritual activity thing, I mean, what I heard was that like it was tailored, there's going to be stuff that's tailored towards what fans want. Hardcore fans want more grind, more ritual activity stuff, reworking stuff. I wouldn't be shocked if they like did some like revamps of that stuff in some way or another. And yeah, I mean, seasonal stuff is still going to happen. There's still going to be season passes. And I think that the eventual plan is to, and this is like a ways out, this is kind of pie in the sky stuff, so nothing concrete at all, but the eventual plan is to actually try to come up with like an onboarding solution, maybe rebrand it. I mean, it's still hilarious that they call it Destiny 2 and they haven't just renamed it to like Destiny, the experience, like Destiny, Destiny Infinite, Destiny Infinite, Destiny Forever. But some sort of like onboarding experience is definitely part of the plan as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that like as players, the hardcore players see what's coming, I think it'll be a little less of the doom and gloom, like, oh my God, Destiny's dead. But then again, who knows? I mean, the thing about Bungie is that I think people have always thought that Bungie had more of a long-term plan than they actually do. Like there's always been a lot of kind of short-term scrambling, last minute scrambling to change things around, and visions kind of evolving as time goes on. So I wouldn't be shocked if they have like a more concrete plan for the next, I don't know, 6 to 12 months, and then after that it's a little more hazy. And then the other part of this equation, of course, is the human part, which is that like Bungie just lost between the layoffs and the Sony moves. They've lost something like 500, 600 people over the last 2 years, a lot of whom were on either the Destiny team or support teams like QA and narrative and audio and player support. And so losing those people, you like are losing resources, you are losing people who contributed a lot to the game, and the people who are remaining are going to have to like work twice as hard because they have to do jobs of people who are now gone, and it's just kind of a messy situation that will just inevitably lead to challenges, unfortunately, for those people left.
And I mean, speaking of, I was going to say, what's the temperature check on how Marathon is going?
Not great from what I've heard. There's a reason that it was planned for this year and slipped a whole year, and people that I've talked to are a little pessimistic about it even hitting its current planned deadline, but we'll see. I don't know exactly when that is, sometime in 2025, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, the sentiment I've heard is not great around it, at least as of a few months ago.
Okay, right. So, because that was going to be definitely one of my big questions is, have you spoken to anyone that's like, yeah, man, Marathon, wait till you see Marathon. Like, this is it, man. We're ready to go. Like, nothing, no one has said anything close to that.
No, and I'm not sure it's the right bet. Like, it's what, an extraction shooter? Like, so PvP, is there any PvE attached to that? Like, I don't think that that's what a lot of Bungie fans are looking for exactly. So it is kind of a strange bet, at least from my kind of subjective standpoint. The other important thing to know is that Marathon has had a big leadership shakeup. They lost a director a few months ago, got a new director a few months ago, and during this round, their executive producer left the studio as well, so they are going through some changes for sure.
So Marathon's executive producer left during this round of shakeup.
I believe that's, let me double check the title to make sure that I'm
sure.
Yes. Yeah, oh, well, I guess, okay, so Carrie Guskus, according to LinkedIn at least, she was executive producer until April, so I guess that was the same time that Chris Barrett, who was the director, left, and then she was senior director of development. But yes, she just left. I guess she wasn't EP, she stopped being EP on Marathon in April, but she did just leave as well. So yeah, there's a huge leadership shakeup on that team in April. It'll, I guess we'll see what happens there.
And you know, you have your perspective on it as well. Speaking as someone who plays Destiny and obviously talks to a lot of Destiny people, there's not a lot of excitement for Marathon, like within the Destiny community. Like that's not what we're about at this point. Like ultimately, Destiny is right now a PvE game. It has this very awkward PvP thing bolted onto it that is essentially decayed over the years because Bungie have not invested in it. So Bungie's fandom right now is a PvE audience, and they're also older, which is something else that came out in the reporting, that the audience who plays Destiny is older. Older PvE focused players are not interested in an extraction shooter. Like, that's just not it. So Bungie really are trying to build an entirely new audience here, and it seems like they're trying to do it with this massive investment, hundreds of people, hundreds of millions of dollars spent, it seems, whereas it would have been far smarter for them to make this a smaller bet and to sort of seed it into the community and build it up over time and prototype it over time. It's just, this seems crazy to me, and I'm crossing my fingers that this is great, because it just seems so risky. You know what I mean? And I would... is there any sense of what would happen, any discussion about what would happen if Marathon didn't pop off? Did anything pop up in those discussions?
I don't want to speculate. Definitely have that conversation with people, but it would be irresponsible for me to be like, well, Bungie's going to shut down if that doesn't happen. The one thing I will say though is that this is going to lead to some exclamation points, and if we were streaming right now, there would be some funny faces in chat. But I will say the Marathon story kind of reminds me of Suicide Squad, and the reason for that is because Suicide Squad started development in 2017 when live service was the hot new thing, and because of sunk cost fallacy and because of endless delays and because there wasn't really an interest or willingness in canceling it because they had committed so much money to it, and there was just a belief that like, all right, we want to get this out, it's going to be cool, it came out and just totally flopped. And I'm worried about Marathon being in a similar situation where it's been in development for a while. It entered development when extraction shooters were super hot. I don't know if that's the case anymore, and now because they've committed so much money and because it was the project that was furthest along as opposed to all their other incubation bets, they are really putting a lot into it, and I'm just not sure there's much of a chance that it will be successful. But then again, you never know. Like, if you had asked me in January, like, I would have been like, yeah, Helldivers 2, that game is going to tank so friggin' hard. It looks like a disaster. And of course it turned out to be the biggest thing ever. So that's why I like to report and not so much to make prognostications, but still it doesn't like give me the best vibes when I hear about that. Although I did have, to your point, Ralph, this is my aged Destiny fan speaking, but I did have lots of good times with Trials of Osiris back in the day.
Sure. That was back in the day. It was good shit. And unfortunately what happened to Trials is because the PvP community shrunk so much, the only people who were playing Trials were just your hardcore sweats. And so if you weren't like a top 1% player and you stepped into Trials, you would just get dumpstered, and it became this self-fulfilling prophecy after that, you know.
So how does that go with you not being caught up on the current game lingo? Are you just lurking and doing research? Are you talking to community members? Are you talking to people like Ralph behind the scenes?
So, okay, let me back up a second. I'm going to play a little more of the context game like I did before. So this thing came out in 2014, and I remember I got a free copy at the office. My colleague Tina Amini gave me a copy and was like, hey, check this out. I was like, I'm never going to play this, but okay, whatever. I'll pop it in at home, and wound up spending hundreds and hundreds of hours playing Destiny 1 over the months and being one of those, like, complaining about it. My wife would ask me, Jason, why are you playing that game that you just complain about the entire time you're playing it?
He's a real fan. He just like us for real.
Exactly, yeah. And so it wound up being really good for my career as well, because I was so into the game that I wound up really wanting to report on it. When I saw that story of Destiny 1 that ended with that ridiculous boss fight in the Black Gardens where like you just fight 3 robots and it's like it just ends with that kind of unexplained nonsense from the speaker, and like I don't have time to explain why I don't have time to explain and all that shit. I was like, what happened here? I have to know. And I wound up talking to a lot of people at Bungie. I wound up breaking a lot of news. My Destiny story that I wrote about the behind the scenes of what happened in 2015 actually led to my now literary agent reaching out to me and being like, hey, do you want to do a book like this?
No way.
And led to me writing Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. So Destiny has been very good for my career. My obsession with that game. And I don't think I would have cared nearly enough to report on it if I wasn't obsessively playing it. Wound up having
we're not so different, you and I, Jason.
Yeah, right? Like, you know how it is. It's so interesting. Back when I was at Kotaku, we used to have this conversation all the time about how like the gaming industry is so hard to cover because unless you're immersed in a community, it's really difficult to really know it and like be able to cover it thoroughly. Fortunately, Destiny was so high interest at the time that like we were able to cover it and people really cared about it and all this news we were breaking. It was really cool. And then I had a really interesting love-hate relationship with some people at Bungie over the years, and it was a fun time. And then I stopped playing after like Forsaken, so that was a year into D2. D2 did not grip me nearly as much as D1 did, and I was kind of like my obsession with D1 was borderline unhealthy, and I got it all out of my system. And then since then I haven't reported nearly as much on Bungie, in large part because I'm not into the game, and so I'm not following the nitty-gritty in the same way that I used to. It was like I was reporting on very specific things in D1 back in the day, like talking to people about Yallarhorn and like why this one gun wasn't working the way it should, and yada yada yada. I remember asking someone specifically, like, "Hey man, like why do purple engrams drop blue gear? This is really pissing me off." Like those are the days. Destiny 1.
That's a deep cut, man. That's a deep cut.
Yeah, man. God. Destiny 1. That was a game with some problems.
Yeah.
So and then I fell off a little bit, and still have written a few things about Bungie here and there, and talked to people and kept in touch with people and so on and so forth, but definitely have not reported on the game and the developers in the same way that I used to, because I'm not as kind of invested in the day-to-day of Destiny. And then so cut to now, where I've been talking to a bunch of people for a couple of different things I'm working on, and it's definitely, I definitely have to kind of like brush up and go read the Destiny the Game subreddit a bunch, and like trying to figure out, like, someone was like, I asked someone, so what's the plan monetization wise for the future? And this person was like, okay, we're gonna do season passes, we're gonna do dungeon keys. I was like, dungeon keys? What the fuck is a dungeon key?
Good question, man.
Like,
Good question.
So I have to like really start like brushing up on this stuff in a way that I never had to before, because I knew the game cold. So it's been interesting as a reporter. Just kind of having a relationship with a game, a service game, really changes the way that you are able to report on it. Also, the other part of this equation is that like when I was really into Destiny, I could have much better conversations with people because I knew their game well, and they would feel comfortable being like, oh, this and this, and I could really get into it with them, which I think was a good way to get to know people and talk to them specifically about the game. So it was a fun time, but that part of my life is over now. As much as I might look over at like Final Shape longingly and be like, I wish but then again, when I read about Final Shape, it's talking about like The Witness, and I'm like, I don't know anything about who, like, I thought Nathan Fillion, I thought Cade Six was dead. Like, why is he here again? Like, what's going on?
It's a whole thing, man. It's a whole thing.
Yeah. I don't feel like I'm missing on that much.
Yeah, well, look, I do think it's a pretty great expansion. I
don't mean to demean it. I just, from my own personal, like...
Sure, I get you. Yep. I was interested in Payback because we'd heard it mentioned. I know Totillo and Grubb provided a little bit of reporting on it, but then you provide a little bit more. Could you tell us what Payback was, what happened to it? Like, just give us the Payback rundown.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was tweeting that like, hey, Destiny 3 wasn't canceled because despite these rumors, because it wasn't in development, and a couple of people were like, why you always got to shoot down Grubb? And I was like, Grubb didn't say Destiny 3 was in development. Like I saw a bunch of other Destiny sites say Destiny. That's why I'm tweeting this. And people always think that I'm like subtweeting Grubb when I like Grubb. I was just on a podcast with him a couple months ago. Anyway,
Grubb rules.
Yeah, so Payback was a project that I believe Luke Smith and Mark Noseworthy, who are now no longer with the company, they were helming, and the idea was like it would be a third-person game, which I think alone makes it very clear that it's not Destiny 3. It would be a third-person game. It was co-op heavy. I think PvE mostly. I think exploring a world and just doing challenges and stuff together. And I think the kind of the core gimmick of it was that you'd play as like characters from Destiny, if I'm remembering correctly. This is me off the top of my head. I don't have my notes in front of me, but I believe it would be like heroes like from Destiny. Kind of like Genshin Impact, except the monetization wasn't going to be like gacha style, like Genshin Impact style.
It wasn't.
It was not. No,
because your thing said Warframe and as in inspirations from Warframe and Genshin, and I was like,
Yes.
oh no, is this like, you know what I mean?
No, the part of Genshin that would be the character part, not the monetization part.
Okay.
Like the idea of like taking on these heroes, like you do in Genshin.
Yeah.
And yeah, Warframe in terms of like third person, and yeah, that was the idea, but I think it was pretty early. Like I'm not even sure how far into development it got. It was just one of those many incubation projects that have been canceled over the years. There have been multiple Destiny spin-offs, multiple tries to like figure out what comes next after Destiny 2. That was a big conversation. It's like, what is the Destiny universe? What does that look like after Destiny 2? Which they still don't have the answer to, as far as I know.
Yeah, right. Interesting. Yeah, that was a big revelation in the reporting as well. Like Destiny 3 not happening. And
which, by the way, Bungie has said publicly multiple times.
But like they're always going to say, well, I don't know that I don't think they've ever said publicly, we are not making Destiny 3. They've never once said those words. They've always just said like, oh, we're always evaluating the future of Destiny. And we've got so many bright ideas and whatever. And at the same time, without committing to saying, oh, we're only going to stick with Destiny 2. Like, that's all we're going to do. So that door was open, and I think we kind of filled it with our hopes and dreams, you know what I mean? In terms of what we would like to see.
I think it's worth noting here that Bungie, of course, launched Destiny with Activision Publishing and was working with Activision for about 5 years after Destiny's launch. And the Destiny contract, which leaked many years ago, hilariously thanks to the lawsuit, the legal battle between Activision and the creators of Call of Duty, who then went on to found Respawn. Because of that, the Destiny contract leaked, and it showed that Bungie was on the hook for year 1, Destiny 1, then Destiny 1 expansion, Comet, then Destiny 2, then Destiny 2 expansion, then Destiny 3, then Destiny 3 expansion, then Destiny 4, then Destiny 4 expansion. That was the plan. And that
so
went
wild,
that was yeah. Oh yeah, man. Which is, I mean, that's Bobby Kotick in a nutshell. God, you gotta wait till you see some of the Bobby Kotick stuff in this book. You guys are gonna get a kick out of it.
So excited.
Because he's all about annualization, and that was part of, I mean, at Blizzard, it was a big fight about why Blizzard was not able to release new World of Warcraft expansions every single year. Anyway, so this is a big tension point between Activision and Bungie, because Bungie was like, look, we don't really want to go on to make Destiny 3. We think Destiny 2 works better as an ongoing service game where we just keep adding to it, because one of the things that was most controversial, if you guys will remember, about Destiny 2 was that it was a character reset. Like, you didn't get to keep anything from D1. So the idea of like all these Destiny 2 players being committed for just 2 years and then them moving on to Destiny 3, like that was not appealing to Bungie. So Bungie and Activision, they did some negotiations. Bungie got out of the contract. Bungie got to keep the Destiny IP. And as a result of that, Bungie was no longer on the hook to make Destiny 3. And so and then we saw what happened. They just kept releasing expansions for Destiny 2 instead. So the fact that like from the beginning, this was all the current state of Destiny 2 is essentially because they didn't want to make a Destiny 3. It's hard to imagine them suddenly changing their mind about that. It's also hard to imagine where a Destiny 3 would even go, like, unless they spent 5, 6, 7 years just squirreled away making completely new races and universes and planets and everything, and even gameplay. Like, it's hard to imagine it not feeling very samey. So yeah, I don't know.
I think that's true. I mean, the counterpoint to that, I think, would be that, you know, times have changed since back then with regards to where the game is and how developed it is, how many systems it has, how big our arsenals are, you know, just the number of modifiers on our gear, you know, like there's so many that it can be, even not all season players feel this, but certainly some feel like, hey, a reset would be kind of nice at this point. It'd be nice to begin this journey again, you know? But obviously many players don't agree with that. And they're like, no, I want to keep what I have forever. I personally have never been into that idea, but yeah, I get it. I understand it.
Yeah, to be clear, the reset was much less palatable in 2019 than it would be today. The problem is that like all the people who you have on the Destiny 2 treadmill are your people who know how to make Destiny games. So like, what are you going to do? How are you going to take all of those hundreds of people and move them to Destiny 3, and then Destiny 2 is just going to go like dormant for 5 years? Like, how is that going to work practically speaking? Which I think is like speaks to one of the problems that Bungie ran into, which is like they started all these incubation projects and none of them really paid out, and like even if they did, how do you handle that without expanding to 2,000 staff or something insane like that? And that burn rate was out of control, and as Pete Parsons said in the blog post announcing all the layoffs, they were in the red, they were losing money. Bungie was not profitable, and that's not something that Sony is going to tolerate for very long.
Yeah, that's my question. Is there any inkling as to anything changing up with the relationship with Sony? Is Sony looking to take more control, pay a little more attention? Because the whole thing when they brought them on, they were like, we're going to let them do their thing. But obviously there's such a big reduction, and the expansion is kind of wrapping up. So how are things?
Yeah, I think that's been a little bit overblown. I'm not 100% sure because I haven't talked to people on in Bungie's board, and I think they're the ones who would really have insight on this. But I think that okay, let me go back to another Blizzard parallel here, because a large chunk of my book and a large chunk of the Blizzard story is about the Activision taking more control of Blizzard. And I think that's an interesting parallel, because what did that mean exactly? Well, in this case, it meant Activision bringing kind of an ethos of predictability and hitting deadlines, and Wall Street predictability and hitting deadlines, and like annual schedules, and like that was kind of the Activision mentality. Activision is an organization that is structured to have like the commercial stuff, the marketing on top, and developers are kind of below that, and they have very different priorities than Blizzard did. Blizzard was a culture where the developers had all the power and everyone else was subsidiary to them. So when Activision came into Blizzard, that had a very clear outcome and led to very clear tensions. I don't know that there's as much of a clear divide between Sony and Bungie to the point where it would really be like, oh man, all these Sony people are coming in, they're really going to change our culture. Don't get me wrong, Bungie has a very interesting, unique culture of its own and has its pros and cons, of course, but it's not like there is some strong ethos at Sony that runs counter to Bungie's culture and mantras and ways of making games. In fact, I would say that you look at PlayStation, they have a pretty healthy first party stable of studios, and they tend to give those teams like a lot of time and leeway and creativity, despite other than like the recent service game chasing, but that was a whole nother story, and Bungie makes service games anyway. So I don't really think that I don't know, Herman Hulse coming in and saying I'm in charge now is going to have much of an effect, other than maybe like a bunch of old school Bungie people getting mad and leaving, which could be healthy for the studio anyway. So yeah, I'm not sure what that exactly will lead to, or how much validity there is to that. That said, I mean, also the other part of this is that Sony took control when Sony paid $3.6 billion to buy Bungie. Like, we might be any talk of Bungie's autonomy is a little bit overstated, I think, because this is very much a subsidiary relationship. It's not like two parallel orgs, or like one org that is maybe like slightly below the other but has enough clout to be able to push back against pressures or something like that. This is very much a subsidiary relationship. That said, I mean, org wise, maybe Bungie is folded into PlayStation Studios at some point, but I don't really know what that does that make a difference practically speaking? I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Has any of your reporting here or elsewhere looked at sort of Sony's live service push, how that's tracking, internal chatter about that, where that's headed? Anything that you've uncovered on that front?
Yeah, I mean, how about all those Sony live service games? How about that
Concord's
Last of
coming out
Us
in a couple
Online?
weeks.
Oh man, yeah, Concord.
Concords in a couple of weeks. Yep.
God, yeah, I that's very curious to see what happens with that one. Yeah, well, I was playing The Last of Us Online last week and really enjoyed it.
Of course you were.
And then I switched
Me too.
And then I switched to Horizon Online and just had a blast. And after that, Spider-Man Online, it was just like so much fun. Yeah, I mean, it was always just kind of like this trend chasing to the extreme. The video game industry has always just been trend chasing to the extreme, but the service game push is really one of the more egregious examples of that. And the list of like games that have been pivots from single player studios to online to like trying to make service online games that just turned out to be debacles is very, very long. And I think I've done postmortems for a lot of them. It's just like the cycle is single player studio, super successful, pivots to live service. Spent 7 years making a live service game that nobody wants. Live service game comes out, is a debacle, gets a Bloomberg postmortem written about it shortly afterwards. Like that's the cycle. And I'm glad that a company like Naughty Dog was able to stave that off and cancel their project. And yeah, hopefully it stops. Hopefully it doesn't happen anymore. To answer your question, I mean, I think the results kind of speak for themselves. Sony definitely still has. I mean, Horizon Online is actually still happening. Still in development, I should say. I don't know if it's ever actually going to come out, but still in development. So some of those games have come are still in production or have come to fruition, but I'm not sure. I mean, I guess Helldivers 2 is a success, but like
that's one question I had in terms of, we hear chatter about the idea that, you know, publishers will just put out live services expecting that 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of them will crater, because all you need is one. And then after that, you've got your Apex Legends, or you've got your Rainbow Six Siege, or you've got your whatever, you know? And I wonder if Sony's strategy is partly that, because at one point they had greenlit 12 live services. Excuse me. 12 live services. They couldn't have expected them all to succeed. So maybe they were just fishing for one, you know?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have access to Sony's accounting, but that would be an extremely expensive strategy. It's not like, I mean, the model for that is the venture capitalist strategy with like startups, and to a lesser extent with video games, where you go and seed 50 startups and hopefully one of them becomes the next Facebook. But in that model, you're maybe seeding these startups like a couple $1 million, maybe 10 million at the most. Whereas with this live service push, I mean, Naughty Dog's Factions game was in development for something like 4 years with a team in the hundreds. Like that is an expensive proposition for something that was a miss. A lot of these and that, I mean, that project, like that getting canceled was not a bloodless endeavor. There were some heads rolling at Sony as a result of that one. So I think despite the kind of this internet punditry, I don't really think that is what Sony was thinking. I think Sony was thinking, this is a lucrative strategy. Let's push for it as much as possible. Because again, remember the times when that sort of thing would have been greenlit, when that strategy would have been greenlight, it seemed like every service game was like the hottest thing ever. I mean, the numbers, if you go back and look at the numbers of Call of Duty Warzone in 2020, it is just head exploding.
Fall Guys, like it was always
a lot of these games were just hits, like hit after hit after hit. And of course, going back to Fortnite in 2017, like you had a lot of these games that were just really hitting. So I think that more is the strategy, is like, we're going to try to emulate all these huge successes as opposed to we're going to throw out a bunch of bullets and hopefully one of them hits the target.
Yeah. Well, I think what lays ahead for Bungie is a very tumultuous period. I mean, obviously, they're going to have to kind of steady the ship after all of this. Internally at the studio, that's going to be really tough. They have to try and rebuild confidence in the future of Destiny, because right now everyone's feeling pretty low. And obviously, they have to ship Marathon in 2025 or beyond, and that is going to be a pretty risky bet, as we've discussed. So I'm sure there's going to be lots of reporting coming through, and I'm sure you'll be all across it. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we're really looking forward to having you back to talk about your book, which is dropping in October. Is that correct? Is that
coming soon? Yeah, I can't wait. Okay. 2 months away.
Okay.
It's gonna be. I'm gonna be doing the podcast rounds. I'm gonna be talking about it quite a lot. I'm very excited for people to read this thing.
Awesome.
Come on down. You're like a regular at this point, right?
Yeah.
Like, does he get a jacket?
Totally.
Do we give him a jacket?
I'm excited.
Working
I'm
on it,
excited.
working on it.
I got some excited tweets when Ralph, when you announced that I was coming on. Some people were like, "Oh, can't wait!" I got a couple of texts. People
Nice.
were jazzed.